our guest of tonight, which will be introduced by Martine de Masseneer, who worked a lot with Mr. Goldberg and is our Vice Dean of Internationalization of the faculty. So maybe Martine, go ahead.
Yeah, good evening to everybody. Yeah, let me introduce Geoff Goldberg, which I met actually for the first time some 3 years ago when visiting Chicago for a study trip relating to my Chicago master dissertation studio that I run now already for a couple of years. And then it was at UIC School of Architecture that I was introduced by its director, Bob Somel, to Geoff Goldberg for a debate concerning Chicago's future and some iconographic buildings by architect Bertrand Goldberg, actually Geoff's father. Among some of his iconic buildings are, as you might know, the Marina Towers and the Riverside Project in Chicago, the latter which we were also able to visit together with the students, which was really great. Then in November 2019, Geoff gave us an interesting first look into the archive of Bertrand Goldberg, which he will take up also today, I think. Then Geoff itself has practiced for more than 30 years in Chicago as an architect and urban designer. Along with his own practice, he has also taught architecture design and theory at the University of Illinois at Chicago for several years. Current focus is on notions of form, particularly the construction and composition of complex shapes. As part of the research on the history of form, he digs into the archives of several architects and artists. Work has been done at a variety of scales, from details to managing large urban infrastructure projects in both the public and private sector. Awards have been given to him for design, urban planning, and writings on engineering. Geoff is a native Chicagoan and received a BA in political science from the University of Chicago in '77 and an MA from the Harvard University in '82. One of his essays which struck my attention was "Heritage is Ineffable," where he states, "Merely being aware of heritage is not enough. It demands to be considered, for its needs to be properly framed, again requiring intelligence. The considered work or object of heritage has to be placed in a context, located in place and in time, and even more critically, in relationship to others. A context has to be constructed." The essay also including questions as, does legacy exist if we ignore it? And that's maybe also the link to the focus of our own legacy thematic of this year, namely contested legacy. Please, Geoff, the floor is yours.
Your camera mic, Geoff, is off. So you have to put it
better now. Thank you, Martine, and thank you, Lilette, for the invitation. I'm pleased to join you this evening or this morning, depending on how you look at this. If you don't mind, I will take us straight to a screen. So let me see if I can do this. Are we good?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay. Today I'd like to talk to you about thoughts on the curvilinear. Yes, it's curvilinear in the third dimension, but in general, it's a discussion about curvilinear both in the arts and in architecture. The talk is clearly about legacy, but it's also about craftsmanship. And so you may find it bridging between those two sectors, which could be an interesting point for discussion. The image here is one that from Marina City, a project of my father's, and it is the It's a very particular space, which is relatively unheralded, but I find the most provocative. We will discuss these things as we go on. So there are several things that we will discuss today. I call this working legacy. It could be working a legacy or a working legacy. But the notion of legacy just sitting there as something you sort of pull out of the shoebox and put on the table is of little interest. What is of interest is to what extent can we learn from legacy, and to what extent can we work legacy to learn more from it and to make it tell us things. So in this case, there are 4 sections, if you will, to the talk. The first is about technee. The second is kinship. The third is the notion of collegium. And the fourth, in conclusion, is about influence. I wish to caution you that we will cover a lot of ground in these brief 40 minutes or so. So put on your seatbelts and your roller skates, and off we go. So there'll be a fair amount to see. So we start with one of my father's very early pieces of furniture. My father, Bertrand Goldberg, was born in Chicago, went to the Bauhaus in 32 to 33 at the age of 18, worked in Mises' office as a young pup. I think he probably pushed a broom, and came back to Chicago and worked for several notable Chicago modernists, Paul Schweiker, George Fred Keck, and some others. It was a very interesting group of people. He branched out on his own in the late 30s, is still really only in his 20s. And one of the things he did in the late 30s was this chair with a friend of his from the Bauhaus, a man named Michael Van Buren. They participated together in this. They each did their own chairs. So this is my father's. And the thing to note here is not just the bent ply or the composition, but notice it's really 2-dimensional curves that are extruded into the 3rd dimension. So the real breakthrough that happens later by Eames is only a few years off. So this is not technically radical. It's just a fairly strong composition. He did other furniture through the 40s and into the early 50s, all of which is provocative. It's quite unconventional. The top one is literally two incomplete triangles of wood, 2 V's that are hinged, making 3 points at the bottom and at the top. And if you think hard about this, the top points are held in place by the glass operating as a diaphragm. All right. And so this is a very unusual notion about how to make a table. And that's much of what his work was. It's looks one way, but has a deeper understanding. The one on the bottom is a heavy piece of plexiglass held up on custom legs that are made out of bicycle spokes. And if you know your bicycles, which I'm sure you do, spokes are meant to be in tension, not in compression. So he's kind of going against the grain, sort of intentionally. It's a little bit of a dare. A couple of other pieces of furniture that are of interest is bedside table on the left, with chrome, with stainless, lucite, leather, wood, a whole bunch of materials. And on the right is a bed he made for himself and his wife. And if you'll notice the curved corner made in wood, and again, it's still a 2-dimensional corner. It's not, there's nothing incredibly radical, except the craftsmanship is quite fascinating. At the same time, in the early 50s, he was involved in industrial design and developed what is called a plywood box car. The box car that is not made of metal, it's made of wood, and it operates as a tube structure. And it's a very interesting concept, and it required an enormous amount of engineering and research. It's unbelievable how much work went into it. But one of the things on the left, which is worth noting, is that the corner construction, again, it's mostly 2-dimensional, and it's patented. And I remember my father telling me about making the final end piece, the curved corner piece of this was quite difficult. So already at this point, he's bouncing up against the problem of how do you put this curve into 3 dimensions? This is a dining table that he did in the early 1990s. It was a redo of an earlier one, and he got more expressive in this one. But I want to point out that the notion of the support being these bent and pulled and then chromed steel rods that go into balls that are without welds that are showing. It's kind of a vacated corner. All right, again, it's quizzical, and the space is rather dynamic with regard to this table. So again, there's explorations in technee that are going on through these furniture experiments, if you will. They were working tools for him. The first of his three-dimensional curved buildings is a project proposal in 1956 for a recreational center down in Alabama. And it's got these kind of doily leaves for roofs, which we did not understand or actually give much import to until just a few years ago, when more careful looking at the archives revealed the working drawings for this, which is shown on the bottom. And you may see, I don't know if you can see clearly, but there's this sort of curved piece that you can see it on the top one. It's a pipe. It's a 3-inch pipe. Well, what's that all about? Well, we actually went through it in some detail, and the sequence is shown on the upper, on the left side here. You take a curved pipe on the ground and you bend it. It's roughly 7-centimeter pipe. Then you tilt it up at 45 degrees and you stick it in the ground. You do this 4 times, and then you fill it in between them with the red lines in the second drawing. And then you raise a center post and you loft, if you will, from that out to the perimeter. And there you get your wobbly doily shape. It's a rather interesting notion. And again, you know, one of the differences between Europe and America is that we're far more stingy about labor costs. Labor tends to be high cost here. And so he was always interested in how do you get away from handcrafted and how do you industrialize this? So you can sort of see that process here. This project did not go ahead. And the one that ultimately put him on the map was Marina City. And again, here's the elevation drawing for this. And this is has a very unusual development history, which is beyond this talk. But I just want to say that his tallest built work before this was a 3-story house. Okay, and these are 60-story concrete towers, which were the tallest in the world at the time they were built. He had no right, if you will, to this commission. He managed to tumble forward in a very unusual way. That's a story for itself. But what you can see here are these balconies that are on the perimeter of each of the apartment units. Marina City consists of a number of buildings, including, if you will, on the right side of the image on the left is a very tall, thin office building. Underneath it is a bowling alley. And the space I showed you at the very beginning is that in-between space, just around the 4th or 5th story there. There's also a theater building, which you can't see. It's tucked behind. So there is Marina City in all of its glory, if you will. And I want to talk about a detail in Marina City, in fact, a few details, which has to do with this perimeter column. People have a very hard time understanding Marina City because it is technically innovative. It's iconographically unusual. It's sculptural, and yet it's also functional. It's a very strange combination, and it's not easy to get a handle on. One of the problems people have is addressing the resolution of Marina City. And part of it is the fine grain. It's that kind of Mies approach. We're either doing the big box or we're doing the corner detail. Okay, and so it doesn't work at the middle scale. It's in the detail. So here is a detail of one of the perimeter columns. It is under the parking ramps. And if you'll notice, that's a rather unusual shape. It's actually a very provocative shape. So a few years ago, I started to look into this a little bit more in more detail. And the balconies shown on the left here during construction without their railings are actually quite large. And they have these sort of side haunches as the perimeter beams come down to meet the column. And you can see it in the drawing on the bottom right. And then from the, this is not a working drawing, it's actually a structural diagram on the top showing what's going on at the column. You'll notice the column shape is unusual. It's a trapezoid with its ends cut off. So it's an 8-sided column, if you will. And if you start to investigate that column more, there's a few things that are interesting. First, how could such an unusual shape be economical? Marina City was built at the cost of public housing, which is staggering. And so the question is, how could you possibly do something this custom? So under this notion of mass customization, back in 1960, they developed a fiberglass form, which they reused. And there are 18 of these columns per floor times 60 floors times 2 buildings. So they were able to get their use out of them. They are very hard to find any images of. So this is all I've got. But at least we have something. And I think the image on the left is reversed, but there we are. So the parking structure is on the upper right, and you can see the forms there. So that makes some sense. That's reasonable. But if we look at them formally, these are reconstructed models of the column that we did. This is just one image, one model looked at in different ways. You can see that all sorts of things are happening. First of all, between the 2 balconies, there's a flat face in the upper right. In the bottom right, you'll see that internal flare within the apartment as it returns to become a structural beam that goes back to the core. It's a very unusual shape. And it's been pulled out of the building, if you will, to look at it on its own. And so this got me thinking, where does this come from? I mean, this is not Mies. This is not easily predicted from any part of his experience. How do you get to this? That's an interesting question, at least I thought it was. So I started looking a little bit further. And this is the space I showed you at the very beginning. This is between the office building, which is a sort of an exoskeletal structure of cast concrete columns, if you will, on the upper part, and the sort of bowling alley on the bottom. But if you look at the detailing between these flared, what are they, arches, shapes, the detailing is phenomenally crisp. Where did this discipline come from? There's nothing in the earlier work that would suggest this level of skill or this level of particularity. How did he get to this? And of course, he's not here anymore. He's been dead for 25 years. And so it's hard to ask him. And I started poking around a little bit further. So the first thing we did is try to understand that space underneath. And here it is in construction. And it is rather unusual. It's a very particular shape. And unlike the office building, unlike the towers, this set of arches underneath here are much more handmade and much more customized. And this is the shot of them once completed. So we decided to try to understand how they had been drawn and how they had been engineered or understood. So we developed a very complicated three-dimensional model of them and found out that the sections between them, between north and south and east and west, are in fact quite different. They are not just a simple set of relationships. And in fact, we made a physical model of them, and this is a Rhino version of it, and this is upside down. But you can see that roofscape is really quite complicated. And it starts, of course, with, well, why don't we take that trapezoidal column and use it over here? And why don't we just flare up? Well, of course, the geometry off that trapezoidal column is actually quite complicated. And if you go, we went back to the drawings and look, and both sets of sections are what I call Triarch Radiuses. Okay, this is an engineering approach where you use actually 3 different radii to approximate the curve. It's a very complex curve. And in a sense, at the end of the day, these are Gothic. All right, these are not industrial. These are an effort to make in concrete what was being made with, if you will, stone and lath, if you will, in a Gothic cathedral. I think that's kind of curious. While he's working on an industrial project, to have this kind of comment. The next project I wanted to bring up is the Brennaman School, where these concrete shells were done. It's designed around the same time as Marina City. And unlike Candella's work or other work dealing with shells, these are intimately scaled. They are 1 per classroom. And the idea here was to get north light through the clear story and be able to stack these guys up close to each other so you could get 24 classrooms on 1 floor. And still have light, even though you couldn't have side-to-side light. There were issues with these. They did them sort of as a monolithic pour. I think there were cracks, there were leaks. The whole thing has been covered in a big steel box, so you can't actually see them unless you manage to go up into it. But they're really quite interesting when you look at their history. of making them, and I never really quite understood how they were made. If you look on the image on the left, there are these sort of left to right thick lines. And then there appear to be thin lines that go in between those. Well, what's going on is that those are 1.5 inches, or what we might call 4 centimeter steel channels that are bent, much like that pipe we saw before. And they span from one side to the other, and then a reinforcing is put between them, and then mesh is put over that, and then it is sprayed. Right? So these are not handcrafted with molds in the same way that you might see it like a Candela project. Again, going deep into the drawings, there's always been a mystery about this project, because my father in his oral history always refers to it as kind of an arch-like construction. And if you go back and you look at this, I can't understand this arch-like notion. It makes no sense. These are shells. Well, it turns out they played a trick here. They made these individual pieces of channel. There are, I believe, 10 of them, and they are of different sizes. And here's the whole progression of them. And they are placed roughly 4 feet or a meter 20 apart from each other. And they are serving as arches. And if you go back deep into the papers, you find out that they actually calculated as a hyperbolic paraboloid. And then they also drew it as these arches approximating that. And so the construction side dominated over the pure form, even though they're very, very close to each other. There's like 1 inch or 2 difference, a very little difference. So that's kind of interesting. And here it is, if you model it, this is what they're doing with these arches. So now this is our third technique. We had the doily, if you will, from Pineda Island. We had the sort of Gothic. We had also the columns at Marina City, and now we have this one with these arches. So already we're seeing a nimbleness about construction and about techne. The last of the three-dimensional curve approaches in buildings that I want to draw attention to is the ultimate solution where the office went, which is they got out of these complex curves and they got into something called what I call blockouts, which is they would take an extruded shape and they would put blockouts and block out, make openings into it. Now, these are geometrically complicated because they're curved in a bunch of ways, but they're very easy to make. It's quite simple. Just you have your wall form and you block out a certain section of it, and it makes for very dramatic space. So this is where the sensibility is beginning to dominate over the notion of technical inventiveness. They found an answer, and ultimately they use this answer in all their subsequent projects. The office moves into a number of hospital projects, and this was a proposal for one that did not take place, but it was the plan form comes from a notion of patient clusters and where the outboard bathrooms make the kind of bumps in the exterior wall. So it's kind of a shell structure up above, but notice the way it comes down to the ground. It is essentially blocked out, all right? They just take the extrusion and delete a whole bunch of it and tie it back to a central core. Right? And they used this approach in many different hospitals. These are different layouts that they did. And you'll notice, for example, in the upper right, the Brigham and Women's, you can see the way in which the patient cluster is divided up into bedrooms. In each one of these, actually, you can see the bedrooms. And I want to draw our attention to Prentice on the bottom left, which is here. And you can see the same approach to the blockouts. And in fact, this is the only one that purely got this heavy cantilever in place. The structure is a shell hybrid because there's actually some very tricky structural work going on interior-wise. I want to draw your attention to where these cylinders, if you will, intersect. That point where you get this X shape. And if you look at the detail on the right, there is a photograph of it. This building has unfortunately been demolished, but I want to point out that this is an incredible detail. It's meticulous, it's precise, it is absolutely unforgiving, and it's cast in concrete 6 stories up for everybody to see. So if you're not on your game, go home, okay? It's an extremely difficult solution. to do, and it's very, very nervy. Here is the last hospital they did in Alabama, and I show it in construction. Again, it's an extruded shape that's going up, but there's several things that are interesting about this. First, that perimeter wall turns into columns. And as we look at this a little bit more closely, we'll find that perimeter wall actually has different thicknesses. So it's a shell that it's columns that turn into a shell, right? So this is rather complicated construction. And you're getting some very interesting three-dimensional aspects in this. And here's some working styrofoam models from the office about how to figure this out. And you can see the blockout notion on the upper two images, which is really you have a curved wall and you just have a solid that blocks it out, right? So you can see the tricks that they're up to about how do they make sculptural shapes out of simplified construction. The next major project he was known for is one called River City in Chicago. And this was never built in its full extent. That's a separate story, but I want to point out that this notion of these modules of apartments, which are then split to make this interior atrium space, which is we call River Road, is really quite dramatic. He modeled it after Parisian streets, which are quite narrow. It's a space that's meant to be seen along its length, not side to side, and it's incredibly dramatic in its regard. And it's, of course, extremely unusual with the exposure of the concrete and this kind of muscular and yet, in a sense, delicate rendition. So you have this sort of wandering skylight on the top, and you have these modules that are making in their combinations a curved space. Well, the question is still on the table. Where did this stuff come from? We can have discussions about modular versus the universal space of Mies, or we can have discussions about the inventiveness of the construction. But I think there's another place to go, and it's a rather unusual place. And so forgive me if it's yet more family. My father is shown on the left in his office with his sort of unusual things around him. And on the right is his mother-in-law, or my grandmother, a woman by the name of Lilian Florsheim. She lived 3 blocks away from us, and she was an unusual personality in her own way, and she made sculptures. And in fact, in my father's office, in the very far upper left corner, hanging from the ceiling, is one of her pieces. This is a picture that he took of her in the 50s, and she was a very elegant woman. But what is sort of interesting is she became a sculptor in her own right. And this is one of her pieces. I think it's one of her best pieces. It's an extremely unusual piece because no matter how you look at it, it keeps telling a different story. So in a funny way, from the front, it's not symmetrical and yet it's balanced. She takes from some people that we will discuss in a bit, the notion of thickening up for structural stability and thinning it at the edge. And if you look at the image on the right, you get this totally different read. It's almost a violent piece at that point. It's quite rhetorical. It took a while to understand her work, even though I grew up with it. She had a studio 3 blocks away from our house. I was there every week, if you will, but she didn't think so much of her own work to record it. So a few years ago, we decided to do a website on her, which you can find. And I put down, we established a chronology of all of her works to try to understand what she had done because they'd never been cataloged in this way. She'd had shows, she's in museums and whatnot. I wouldn't call her an A-grade artist. I'm not trying to make that point, but there's an interesting one. And the section I want to look at is it's hard to see, but the D and the F, the shapes and the late string, because one of the things we found is a very unusual thing, which is in 1964, she's doing this piece on the right called Curved Surfaces in String. And on the left is this drawing coming out of my father's office for the theater building at Marina City, which is using nautical techniques to make a very interesting curved shape. But somebody's talking to somebody here, okay? It's quite clear that there's discussion going back and forth. It may not have been verbal, right? And I want to be very, very clear here. I do not want to say that the work came out of my grandmother's studio and went to my father's office. I don't believe that to be the case at all. I believe that these were 2 people sharing ideas. And I believe that my father, in a sense, used my grandmother's work as a black box to explore the poetic notions of form in a way that he could not do in his office. And if you look at Gary's office for the sake of discussion, he's got a black box group. Skidmore's got a black box group. But in 1960, 65, that was not common. All right. So he had if you will, an independent researcher investigating form. And that was a rather interesting idea. All right. And I think it may answer a few of the questions. So they decided to dig a little bit deeper. Here's a later piece of hers in string. Right. And you can start to see that she's beginning to explore the relationship between geometries and surfaces. She gets out of the three-dimensional curved shapes much about the same time as my father moves to the blockouts in his work and simplified extrusions, meaning that they got out of this very difficult and customized sense of three-dimensional form, and they start getting into other issues. For her, it's issues of resolution. Right? At what point is pattern and replication and form expressed? Or she moves into the what I'll call op art. You can look at the one on the left is a riff on Marina City. It is not the origin. You have to be very careful here because this happens after Marina City is done. So she's thinking about it. She's commenting on it. Right? She's not influencing it. Right? And lastly, she moved into these very large, what we might even call architectonic pieces. The column on the left is about 6-7 feet high. Okay, so if we go back to Vitruvius and we talk about firmness, commodity, and delight, right? Well, if we take delight and call that form for the sake of discussion, and if we think about firmness as tectonic, how is it made, and structure and its construction, and commodity is its use and its social program, a full analysis of my father's work would require all three of these to be discussed. But today we're only really talking about form and to a certain extent about the tectonic aspects. Okay? And in this discussion, I'd like to propose that form stands outside of time. It aligns with geometry, it aligns with technique, it even has ideals, but let's consider it atemporally. So let's assume that this is not an issue of history, this is an issue of ideas. With that in mind, I plunge us unfortunately right back straight into history because I want to start with the Bauhaus and where my father went. And as you may know your Bauhaus history, it had 3 different directors and it had 3 different locations and they didn't overlap all at the same time. So it's delightfully confusing, but at least we can look at Dessau by Gropius and understand, the Bauhaus structure. I show you this because it's in a sense almost a commentary on Lissitzky's work about corners, where you have a graphic and you have a physical construction that are in dialogue with each other, right? And I show you this because I want to say that at the Bauhaus, everything's up for discussion. All right, so, as you dig into it, you find different things. These are some photographs that my father had from either, I believe these are friends' photographs of his. And again, the one on the right is the shape of a balloon glove, if you will, a distortion of the glasses. And the newsprint, how do you tweak newsprint? How do you cut it up and distort it and have a 2D, 3D object? And one of his main teachers at the Bauhaus was Joseph Albers. And he was quite close with Albers. And on the left is Albers, I believe, either teaching at Yale or in the United States. And on the right is a painting that was in our family of Albers. We had a lot of Albers work around our house. I want to point out that this is not correct, this caption of Goldberg under Albers. I apologize. These are student work under Albers at the Bauhaus where they're dealing with paper. And they're dealing with an understanding of the material structure of the paper and how to make form out of that. They also dealt either in Germany or in the States with distorting material to make form. And I think this is very key to understanding my father's work. There's several things he learned from Albers. These are some drawings of my father's at the Bauhaus. The bottles in space, there's nothing terribly unique about that. I like the weaving and the barbed wire because that notion of 2 and 3D. and simple geometry sketches. Now, mind you, he's 18 to 20 years old at the time, so I don't think anything massively significant is going to come out of his work there. But this is a comment, if you will, on Albers. This is something he gave to my father when he left the Bauhaus, and it's called Esseman. It's done in 33, and it's on the bottom, Albers says, Auf Wiedersehen, Goldberg. So he's saying goodbye. And this is an interesting piece because Albers is often misunderstood through his square paintings only. But in fact, there's a great deal of work about Albers and perception and spatiality and depth. And this piece is part of that. And there's some other ones. This is a piece of that was in our family on the left and the one on the right. The one on the left is about airfields in Mexico. And the one on the right is one of his vinylite pieces where you can see the notion of deep space in a two-dimensional shape. So we start to get spatiality from Albers. These are some photographs that Albers took, these compositions of them. And then if you look on the upper left, you can start to get a sense of spatiality and the crowd and the structure of space. It's interesting to look at a couple of pieces of my father's in this regard. The one on the left was done at the Bauhaus. And the one on the right was done in the mid-60s of a family friend. That notion of the dynamic of space, of people in space. He actually collaborated with Albers on a project. I believe the information is very, very murky on this, but I believe the models on the left are likely Albers designs. They have a subtlety that is, I think, a little bit more than my father's. And the one on the right is what actually got made. And he always attributed the door pattern to Albers. So I think they lost the project on the left and they did something more straightforward on the right. So then the question is past Albers, and past Lilian Florsheim, where else was Goldberg getting his ideas and where else was Lilian getting her ideas? Well, it turns out that Lilian and my father had a good friendship with a woman in Paris by the name of Denise Renae, who was shown on the bottom left. And Denise Renae is an extremely important person in the contemporary art scene in roughly 1950 to about 1975 or 80 in France. And she was involved with abstraction, with constructivism, with kinetic art, with women in art. She was an incredibly strong-willed woman. I saw her again when she was 99, and she was just as formidable at that age as she was when I was younger. And she was very close to a number of the artists of that time, but she also was quite cognizant of the heritage of abstract art in France and in Europe. And she did a show on abstraction creation, which is a group established in Paris in 1931, existing until 35, 36, doing a number of publications. It is a follow-up of a group called Cercle and Carré, which here's a photograph of a show in 1930 with Arp, Mondrian, Van Tongerloo, Torres Garcia. And the group becomes more expansive in abstract creation in the 30s, which has roughly 100 members. They come and they go. And almost anybody dealing with abstraction in Europe was a member of this group. Everybody came through this group. And it was headed by this man named Georges Van Tongerloo. It was originally started by Herbin, and then Van Tongerloo takes it over. And it turns out Van Tongerloo becomes a very close friend of my grandmother's through the 1950s and 1960s. And she visits him frequently and they correspond, and she acquired a number of his works. One of them was actually his first abstract painting in 1917, which was in my grandmother's house and is now at the museum here in Chicago. And she also acquired these didactics on the right about how he went from a nude figure to an abstract shape. Right? Van Tongerloo is a very intense thinker and very, very, very complicated, very, very rich thinker. But you can start to see the issue of abstraction really being on the table. But he also dealt in volumes, particularly in the 1920s. And this is one of his pieces. And if you'll see on the right, there's this drawing of regulating lines. And if you'll notice, it's a straight elevation. It turns out the entire figure was drawn orthographically. So there's plans and 4 elevations, and they all have the same ellipse, and they all have regulating lines. He's a little loose with the regulating lines, but this is her text that she wrote because she was actually a fairly savvy a collector, if you will. Having, in a sense, ridden himself of the outside world, he went to work to set in motion his theories on creation and infinity. When I bought Rapport des Volumes in 1958, which is the piece above, von Tongerloo sent me the drawings with a letter explaining the relation of the drawings to the finished piece. The drawings made on the back of what seems to be advertisement for one of his essays show the plan of the piece in the form of an ellipsoid, which he pointed out has nothing in common with the finished piece, which is simply the relationship of volumes. Now, one can go on, but the point is that he is discussing the issue of geometry and how does it relate to volume. So we're already in thinking land here, all right? This is not just acquisition. This is work to be thought about. And she acquired another piece of his called Planet et l'Espace. She acquired both the bronze and the only plaster original. There are only two versions of this from him. And you can see the complexity of this three-dimensional curved object, which is kind of a little bit of a riff on some work by his friend Max Bill. Now, this piece is important. If you dig a little bit deeper into my father's archive, you find that he took these photographs of the piece. Now, that might by itself seem like nothing. These are 4x5 negatives or 9x12 in metric, a very unwieldy camera, and it's in two totally different locations. Okay, the one on the right is clearly not in anyone's house. So he's out there working this piece. He's actually thinking about this piece. And I find that rather fascinating. If we go to the next person who we might want to make as part of a collegium of thinkers, von Tongerloo was very close with a man named Max Bill. Max Bill had been in touch with my father in 1949 about putting him in his show called The Good Form, which is a very important show that Max Bill puts together on design, ultimately only dealing with Swiss design. And so my father's work is left on the editing floor, but the contact is established early. My grandmother claimed that she went to see some Max Bill work at the Art Institute, and that is what convinced her to get into abstract work, having trouble reconciling the timeline on that. But it's clearly Max Bill was an influence. And in fact, these are two pieces that my grandmother had of Max Bill's. The one on the left being quite provocative with regard to, is it one or two surfaces? And then if you dig a little bit in the Max Bill archive, you find this maquette of Max Bill's. He made larger versions of this, but this is really quite profound with regard to shape, structure, form, rhythm, simplicity, complexity. Right? It's really an incredible piece. And so I would say in the Max Bill world, when you get into these kind of pieces, I think it's really exemplary. There are other ones of his that I think fall a little flat. Well, who else was around in this time? Well, Jean Arp turns out to be a significant player for a couple of reasons. First of all, my grandmother and father both were quite interested in his work. It turns out they were not, if you will, sort of functionally oriented. They were interested in this kind of surreal aspect of art. And I point you to the tapestry on the left, or up above it, this very small collage. That is literally two pieces of paper on a third piece of paper. That's it. And it is an incredible piece of work. It just continues to hold up in its profundity. So these were in the family background, if you will. And if you go back and look at Arp's work, you find this whole notion about human form and his evolution from the surrealist interest to the constructivist interest of his, and his movement into trying to abstract the human figural form into something else. And so you realize that there's an axis between figuration and geometry, and he's clearly on the figural side, except these are extremely unusual forms. I'm sorry for the typo on the bottom. It's Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, or Nagy. This is him. He was at the Bauhaus. He is Hungarian, and he comes through England and comes to Chicago in 1940, in 1937. Sets up the new Bauhaus here in Chicago. And he dies in 1946. He dies early, which is a shame. Because he establishes something called the Institute of Design down in the south side of Chicago. This is him in Chicago. What's interesting with regard to three-dimensional form are these late works of his in lucite, where he's sort of baking and distorting and twisting these pieces. They're really quite complex. At the Institute of Design, they clearly taught about form. Much of this is not widely known. This is from their archives. This is student work, believe it or not, roughly probably in the 1940s, maybe early 50s. And this is a piece I'm particularly fond of, this notion of this kind of defying gravity. And in his book, Vision in Motion, published just after he died, he outlines in his chapter on sculpture the techniques to make sculpture. It's a whole methodology about how do you work a volume. All right, it's extremely explicit and it's very, very clear. One of the things that's interesting is he brings over a guy named Hugo Weber from Switzerland, and Hugo Weber turns out to become a teacher of my grandmother. Lilian Florsheim goes there in 1950-51, and this is one of Hugo Weber's classrooms, if you will. And if you'll notice these little pieces of string up on the top of the photograph, kind of interesting in that regard. And this is a work from the Institute of Design on the left, and a Florsheim study model from 55 that my father took this picture of, roughly 55, we don't know for sure, but she's starting to deal with armature. So this is a technique. It actually has roots in the Bauhaus and a man named Jost Schmidt, and then comes over via Moholy, and then Hugo Weber picks it up, and then my grandmother uses it, and it becomes part of our family, if you will. This is an interesting notion of Moholy. This is Lilian in her studio in 1953. Her work has not taken off by this point. It's actually rather awkward. But if you follow the little numbers, there are 4 string pieces. There's actually that you can see in this image. All right. All of these are gone. We have very few records of this, so we struggle to find it wherever we can. In addition to this, I think another member that you would bring into this, what I call Collegium, would be from the English side of things, where you have Nicholson, Moore, and Hepworth, all of which were represented in my grandmother's house. But I think Hepworth has actually an interesting role here to play. While many don't see her in this regard, the piece on the right is what my grandmother had. What she brings to the table is 2 things. One is a humanity in her writings, which is incredibly sensitive. If you read her autobiographical writings, she speaks about landscape, she speaks about interiority, and she speaks about femininity without pretense. It's quite striking. In addition, she does a number of drawings, and the relationship of her drawings to the sculptural works is really quite fascinating. And it's a different version than Von Tongerloo. It's quite interesting to look at. And obviously another person that was part of this, what I call a collegium, would be Gabo. Was not much discussed. This is his construction number 2, which happened to live on the center of my grandmother's dining table. So every time we had dinner there, this is what we would look at. So it's not hard to figure that must have been on my father's mind somewhere during the dinner conversation. A person who is not represented in our family, but I think belongs as if you will, the last member of what I'm calling a collegium, is Katharina Cobro. She is a complicated figure and a tragic figure, absolutely brilliant. She is trained briefly under Tatlin, we believe, in Russia around 1919, 1920 with her husband Strzeminski, and goes to Poland, and it's where she works. She's in touch with Von Tongerloo. She does incredibly fascinating work, and like Von Tongerloo, she is interested in the space beyond the sculptural piece. And so this is sort of a typical Cobro. Her work is quite complicated to get hold of. Most of it has been lost, and some of it's been reconstructed, but there are roughly 10 to 12 pieces, and they've been extremely highly regarded. And what she's interested in is something called unism, which is the space, how the piece expands from its internal spatial aspects to the space outside. And there's a whole notion about how the viewer moves to engage the piece and constructs a spatiality outside of the piece. It's quite murky, it's quite complicated, but it is incredibly significant. In addition, here is a piece of hers that's published in Abstraction Creation, this form piece, sort of a commentary on figural, not that far apart from von Tongerloo, right? With whom she was in correspondence. So we start to see linkages between all these players. And this is one of her most significant, and her last pieces, it's 1933. This is extremely unusual three-dimensional form. All right, so I'm proposing this kind of a model. All right, if you will, could you find a theoretical group about form that could inspire and inform our own decisions as we think about this? And again, I'm seeing these not as individuals in time, but rather individuals who represent different ideas. The diagram in the blue is Bauhaus. In the red is the Russian representation, if you will, from the Vahudimos in Moscow, which is equally important to the Bauhaus and only now becoming widely known because its archives have been buttoned up. Arp and Hepworth we've discussed, and von Tongerloo ends up being central because he's in the abstraction creation business and holding all of these people together, all of whom are part of it. The dark lines are, they all knew, the ones who knew each other well, close friendships. The dotted lines are in contact with each other. There's a lot of connectivity here, and theoretically, they make a very interesting body of work. I call it material theory because it's a theory about material. It's a theory about form. It's not a conceptual theory independent of that. It's working with things and understanding them. Well, it's an interesting notion. The question is, did it have any relevance for my father, or did it have any relevance for that approach to work? Well, the first is, what's the relationship of two-dimensional and three-dimensional work in his own thinking? And he did not keep a sketchbook. He wrote extensively, but he wrote about ideas about economics, about urbanism, to a certain extent about concrete, but he didn't really write about form so much. And if he did, it was about its relationship to function. His abstract thinking was done through photography. And so these are a couple of his images. You can see the study of pattern, or here you can start to see his interest in three-dimensional form. And again, the one on the left is actually a stone arch, and then he's dealing with aperture on the right. And finally, this piece of this photograph of the wall at Casa Mila, which I think is just incredibly evocative, where he's into the particular of how this surface is made, right? And so from that, I started to go back and look at his own work. This is a project for a large educational facility, but you can start to see, I mean, this clearly has a graphic quality to it. There's not much doubt about that. This is early planning on the right for that mega campus that he did at Health Science Center. And this is a piece on the left of Bornstein, a sculpture that's in my grandmother's on my grandmother's wall. It's a pretty clear connection to me. Again, this piece of my grandmother's on the left. Could it be influencing the thinking on the right? They're thinking about the same things. I don't know that there's a relationship, but, or Alber's notions about how do you make form out of shape. And here is an extremely rare picture of my father holding a conceptual structural model in 1960. This is the only document we have of this, that they're exploring form and structural shape, all right? Plywood Box Car, strengthened materials from Albers on the left. Bending of the paper, bending of the roofscape. A little bit more personal. This is my father's study. He got dressed in the door just behind and in the center of the image on the right. Each morning he would come out through his study to go downstairs, and he would walk by my grandmother's sculpture on the right. It's shown on the left, I'm sorry. It would be on his right as he walked out. Or here he is in roughly 1983, working on River City, and they're looking at the graphics for its promotional material behind him on the wall. You can see all those S shapes. But if you'll notice over his shoulder, up on the top shelf, there's this little squiggly shape. Well, if you look at it closely, it's that von Tongerloo piece. Now, it's an interesting thing. It's the plaster, because he's interested in how it's made, and he had to wrangle it out of my grandmother to let him take it down to his office. Okay. Could you see a connection between the gobbo shape and the columns we were looking at, perhaps? Or the ability to manipulate form to the columns? This Alber's notion of extended space on the top and this dramatic view of River City. I keep looking at these arches and these details, and I keep thinking of Max Bill and the precision. Right? This piece on the left was my grandmother's, but it ended up in our living room. Or Van Tongerloo's thoughts on the relationship between mathematics and form in one of his sketchbooks. And the kind of notion of arch versus shell in Brennaman. This is an op art piece. This is obviously, I'm taking some liberty here. This is an op art piece of my grandmother's, but this vacillation between positive and negative. And here's a study for the wall at River City, where aperture and structure and support are being manipulated back and forth against each other. The argument here is clearly that, not that the art made the work, but that the art opened up his mind to be able to think outside of the norm. And finally, this is a piece of my grandmother's on the left, and these incredibly dramatic curves. And this is at Providence Hospital, where that thick wall and those blockouts come together to make some of the most interesting space that he made. So again, the conversation was about technee to start, kinship, not only with his mother-in-law, but also with what I'm calling this collegium of artists that existed on in our world, that I think actually makes a body of work that can be used critically, and the possibilities of influence. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you. What an incredible story. Really fantastic. It's you really get into that world and into your world and their world to see this. And all the time I keep thinking, especially in the beginning when you were explaining and showing the work, and I was thinking, this is 1960. I was really also thinking that towards the students who you could think like, it's incredible how they created all this without all these computers and without all this software that we have. So it's pretty amazing. I'm super happy with this. I see that Yves Schoonjans is up in the screen, who might want to say something to you or ask a question or join the conversation. Hi, Yves. He's our upcoming dean of the faculty for the coming 4 years. So,
thank you for joining us.
Welcome to our faculty. It is a very interesting lecture and a very fascinating architecture, and also a very, let's say, very inspiring network of very interesting people that, of course, we know. I had two questions. The one question that already started before, you showed very quickly an image of Gaudi, Villa Batelot, I guess it was. So I don't know if your father knew Gaudi well, because if you look towards Gaudi, in the first notion, it seems very poetic, it seems very formally, but there are some research being done, and it's very engineerly, structurally designed. So Gaudi had a very good notion of what structurally could you make, how could you make it, and he used this in a really very designerly way. So I was wondering if first of all, if you knew Gaudi and his work. Secondly, if your father had designer and not let's say engineering skills. And if not, did he have then a kind of a friend engineer where he could talk about this kind of possibilities of making those kind of forms into real buildings with all the structural, let's say, complications of it?
So these are not difficult to answer. He did not know Gaudi personally, of course, but he knew the work very well. He had visited the work. He'd photographed it. I believe that I think it was Casamila, but I may be wrong. You may be right. It may be Pablo. He knew it quite well and had taken a trip to look at it in particular in the 50s and was quite familiar with it. There is, with regard to engineering, my father was one heck of an engineer. He was licensed both as an engineer and as an architect. And I have to put that in context because at the time he didn't have to go to school to get a license in these fields. So he got it from experience, if you will. He was very savvy on structural, mechanical, and also construction methodology, and in particular construction sequencing, which is the secret to much of his work. So that's pretty clear. He worked with the office of Severud on Marina City with a man named Hans Carl Bandel, who was really a kindred spirit. And then he does the other half of Marina City with a man by the name of Frank Kornacker, who was in Chicago, an extremely unusual, brilliant, and difficult man, who had been Mises structural engineer for 86880 Lakeshore Drive and Crown Hall. As I think someone told me, Kornacker was hired and fired 3 times because of the strength of their personalities. So there are different parts of Marina City which are done by both of them, Hans Carl Bandel and Kornacker. Then there's another, he builds up his own engineering team in-house. Basically all the structural engineering was done in-house after Marina City. With some reaching out for certain things like precast particularities that they would go to people. It was quite interesting. When I got to the office in the mid 80s, that kind of structural quality was not there anymore. The good people had moved on. But in the late 60s and early 70s, it was quite progressive. It was also very progressive in its use of computerization. They were deep into finite element analysis. They were into programming. He set up a separate computer office, which he abandoned in the mid 70s because he just got so frustrated with it. But at the time, it and Skidmore were about equal in terms of computerization knowledge in Chicago. And there's a whole technical side to my father's work, which is really quite interesting. Your question brings up one other point, though. There is a second pathway in the 20th century in these unusual shapes. This is a path I've suggested. It comes through art, if you will, and it eventually gets into the schools and comes into architecture roughly in the 50s and 60s. There's another path, which is the engineer as master builder. And there are about a dozen of them. The most notable may be being Gaudí or Eiffel, but you can put Candela and Nervi and Frei Otto and Freycinet. There's a whole bunch of people that go into that. And I think, while I think my father was influenced and provoked by the discussion from the art realm, I think in another part, his other feet were sort of parked in that camp of the master builder. Okay, because he was all over those aspects. I hope that answers your questions.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And there was also a question from William Weary. Maybe you can put it yourself, William. You'll be invited to the screen.
All right, there we go. Can you hear me and see me?
Yeah, perfectly.
So the first questions concern Marina City. So in a 2008 interview I read about Marina City, you said, and I quote, "If you look at the way in which the building is organized, it was not meant to be divided." Could you please develop on that and tell us more about the visionary ideas that founded the project of Marina City?
Well, I think your question is twofold. One is the notion of it being a unified complex, which is fine. I'm happy to talk about that. The second is the visionary aspect to it. I want to caution us on this visionary sense. That's how we might think about it. I don't think that's how it happened. I think this was a tumbling forward kind of project. one is reminded of, the Campidoglio by Michelangelo, which starts as a podium for a horse sculpture. And at the end of that project, there's a plaza, a new building, 2 new facades, and the whole environment, all right? And I'm not trying to say it's in the same league, but it's this notion of you start with a little piece and you end up with more. It was originally meant to be a new office building for the janitors union. And then there was a discussion about housing. And then they had the housing, and the very early schematics are really very crude. And then they came up with this idea of putting the housing in their own towers. And then, oh, what if we lift them up and we get rid of this problem of the lower floors, and we put the parking underneath and we make a plaza? Oh, well, if we're doing it, we want more life here. We want it to be a 24-hour center, so we need entertainment. So that developed this notion of a theater. And the project was fast-tracked. So the towers are built, the substructures put in, the supporting walls for the theater are put in place, and the towers are occupied in 63. The office building isn't finished till 65, right? And the theater, they can't get funding for it. So ultimately it becomes a TV studio in 67, right? So was it a singular vision? No. It was a sense of a 24-hour city within a city. And well, I say no, conceptually, he wanted a city within a city. He wanted it as a contained, you could find all of your activities there. But it was not initially started that way. He developed that notion fairly quickly, like within a year. What happened there was they programmed it. They had, bank, they had pharmacy, they had grocery store, they had all the things that you needed for your life, entertainment, because at the time, downtown Chicago was not in good shape. And this was just across the river from the Loop. And the fear was that all of this arena was going to be vacated in this exodus to the suburbs. And so the notion is how can you make a strong place where people could live and share with each other? Now, there's another thing that was interesting. My father talked about this internal taxation, where the rents were adjusted between the office building to help support other activities on the complex. And so it was seen as under one management. It was designed as under one management. And in the late 70s, this is all done, it's finished, it's successful, it's working fine. The owners of it unfortunately decided to profit and split it up. And so they sold off parts of it as condominiums. They sold the individual units as condominiums. They sold the office complex as a condominium. And it was a mess because these were not meant to be divided. There's circulation paths that overlap and whatnot. It was never designed that way. There's like one water supply that comes in and feeds everybody, that kind of thing. And that's where that comment about not meant to be divided comes up. And so there's a whole series of real estate complications that follow from that. The commercial people think that they can go develop a third tower, and then they run across the fact that there's zoning and they find out they can't do that. And so they go bust. And the whole thing is in a complicated state. Now it's being revived and it's in decent shape, but it doesn't have its original set of uses. The office building's been turned into a hotel. But it's a pretty intense complex, and it's pretty active. So that's that. Okay.
Thank you very much. Perfect answer. And then I had another one. It might be a bit more difficult to answer. I don't know. So it's my understanding that you've put a lot of work into investigating the different things, different people that might have influenced your father into his conceptual vision. Then about the Marina City. I read about those hell meetings that he would attend every morning, and I was hoping you could maybe tell us a bit more about those. As I understand, they were like really about dealing with every problem, all the problems that would come up every day during the construction.
That is correct. No, this is on the construction, understanding construction and process. There's a whole side of my father which is about understanding process. And one of the things that he was extremely good at is calling a decision, knowing when to call it or when to investigate. And architects, as you know, can sometimes be a little bit loose on that. All right. Well, he developed sort of procedures for example, tracking shop drawings. When did they come into the office? How long were they in the office? Who reviewed them? When did they go out? What was the lag time? All right. And he did this also in construction, where he actually was monitoring and managing the construction process as much a part of that as a general contractor. They bid out the project for Marina City with independent contracts. And they then turned to the concrete contractor and said, wouldn't you rather be the general contractor so you could control the site? And he, of course, said, yes, of course I do. And that started McHugh Construction as a large general contractor in business. They were very savvy in this regard. And these hell meetings were with engineers and contractors and designers, all at the table, 7 o'clock every morning. The problem was brought up and it was solved by the next morning or by the end of the day. There was no like kicking it around. We'll think about it. Someone will get back to you, maybe, kind of. No, all that was taken out. All right, and he was brutal that way. All right, but it ends up being appreciated by everybody because there's always a jillion problems. There was a concrete foreman who was very, very smart about concrete. I talked to him when he was in his 90s. And he said he had retired at the time and he was doing some consulting work for the Concrete Association. My father grabbed him out of retirement, hired him as a consultant and sat him at the table. And he said he'd never been at that table. He'd never been able to sit with engineers. And even if he had been, no one would ever listen to him, right? Because, I mean, he's one of these guys, no college degree, but he understood the intricacies of formwork in a way that nobody else at the table would. And that's the kind of thing he was. He'd go up and down the ladder. Okay.
Yeah, that's thank you very much. I think it brings a lot more to the picture of your father. I also have a couple questions from my colleague who unfortunately couldn't attend the end of the lecture. So the first one was, how do you see the curvy forms in residential building? Well, if you want to develop on that or add anything to what you've already said, because I think you've pretty much answered that already.
Yeah, I mean, there are some modest curves in River City. It's really the modules, and if you look carefully, people have talked about these unusual shaped apartments at Marina City, but if you look at them carefully, you find out how they are resolved, and maybe not for everybody, but it's much less extreme in the occupation. There's a kind of spatial dynamic there, but it's not a radical shape that you would find, for example, in some of the architecture we see today. I want to point out that the whole rubric of this discussion is really, if you will, the analog foreground, both my father's work and these artists, to a digital conversation that is going on today with people like UN Studio or Zaha's work or Gary's work or others. So, you need to see this in context.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, because it touches, especially William's first question, and your answer touches upon this, what you said in the very beginning, this relationship between the craftsmanship and indeed the legacy. And your example, of course, of the concrete man coming in, who is basically a craftsman and who knows everything about this material. But it feels like also in this connection with the artworks, this craftsmanship plays an enormous role in all of his work, I guess, no?
Yeah.
And was that something of a personal interest also, or how did that?
Well, I think it was a tension for him. The furniture clearly involves craftsmanship, and it's not the kind of stuff he drew it up and handed it off. I mean, that table made in the 1990s took 2 years to get made, and he was going down to the South Side and meeting with this guy, every month or every week. I remember going with him on one of those, and the guy was so mad he practically threw us out. He was so frustrated. And then 10 years later, he was so proud of the piece. There's definitely this notion of tweaking, okay, that you work the problem. And I think in the realm of today, where we have sort of, you know, theoretical thinking over here and we have working over there, we're not used to this notion of how do you tweak making. And I'm not saying we go back to this. I think we need our own version of it. But you know, I think the quality work of today is doing that, and I think it needs a place at the table. It's why I'm so interested in the subject. The buildings of his, this sort of move to industrial sense, and yet this customization that goes on. I remember finding out in one of these hospital towers that the layout of the structural grid had been rotated so that the columns fit within the walls of the patient layout. Now, you know, that's not what normally people do, right? But there was no way they were going to have a column floating in the middle of a space and screwing things up, right? So there's always this kind of like little edginess going on there of making it a little bit better, making it a little bit, you know, a certain way. And, you know, it's a thorny and knotty set of solutions, which in general defies people's understanding. People have had a very hard time understanding. Part of it's the resolution issue. You really got to get into the grit.
Yeah, I also think like nowadays a lot of software is involved in generating those forms, but here you proves again, like if you want to make it work, if you want to do the step to realization, it's very important that kind of model making and like try to find out how you can do it the most simplest way, like with those the folding of the paper and so on. And sometimes you really have to feel it in a model, I think, in order to completely understand how the form is behaving, and the better you can anticipate also onto it. So yeah, here again, you stresses again the very big importance of model making. I'm still convinced that it takes like a very important place in if you want to come up with really innovative material, not only like formally wise, but also in plan making. It is like a kind of fourth dimension, you know.
Yes.
Model making, and we have to make sure that we keep on communicating this to our students and to encourage them to keep on making models, I think.
I want to show you a piece that is not in the talk, but is related to this. This is a piece of my grandmother's that we call Porcupine. The piece is lost, but we have these pictures. I've actually recreated it digitally. It's made out of triangles, black and white, all of the same size.
Yep.
And she swirls them. And she makes this abstract shape, which is also figural. So there's a humor, which I think is something worth remembering. It's also parametric.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So I think it would be one thing just to sort of say, okay, it's parametric. But what's fun about it is the humor, is the ability to engage the figural, abstract, or geometric discussion at the same time. And I find that quite intriguing. Okay.
Yeah, great. But I also think that like other architects, like also in the end, Le Corbusier actually was doing. Maybe I want to show also something. Share my screen.
I've got the Brussels Pavilion if you want that.
No, I was like looking to, how do I have to share this?
Ronchamp.
I don't know that you see this.
Oh, no, I've not seen this.
It's anyhow. I don't know how to do this. Never mind.
Send the link.
Yeah.
No, you know, the
I
roof,
don't know. I don't know how to share it. You share it, and then on which image do you have to click then in order to share
you
the
have
screen?
under the share menu.
You open your image before, and then you start sharing, and then you click on the image that you see.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, you see this?
You see it now?
Yeah, yeah, that's great.
You see, this is like the roof of Le Ronchamp of Le Corbusier, but it's also done by identical trapeziums. So, and that's something I found out also. Sometimes I think, yeah, it's very at random, but there was a kind of generative element linked with it too. If you see, like, then so there oops, this is very small. How come that it's so small?
It's probably a thumbnail.
Huh? Yeah. No.
No luck.
Never mind. Do you see this?
Yes, 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 yes.
Oh, I'm scrolling to the images. No. I first have to make it smaller. But here you see it too, like exactly Ronchamp rebuilt with 7 identical pieces. This is a model by me at the time.
Wonders.
It's like, you see?
Yeah, yeah.
And actually, I thought he got the idea from the Villa Adrianus. He was visiting at the time, Le Corbusier, the idea of the generative element. And yeah, and he's also talking about like the boat ground of the hill where he was constructing Villa Ronchamp on it, the Chapel of Ronchamp. And yeah, that's how we made it. I'm pretty convinced, and you can see it in pre-stadia of through his models that it was really in there, you know. Yeah, I just want to share this.
No, thank you. This is no because there are 2 core projects that are definitely part of this. Ronchamp is one, and the Brussels Pavilion, the Philips Pavilion at the Brussels in ~59 is the other one. And when I've taught this material, we look at those very, very closely. And in fact, I had a student who built a 3-dimensional model of the Ronchamp roof, which I will send you because it's a polymorphic form. It reads differently depending on where you see it. Okay, it has different configurations. It's it's an amazing shape. Yeah, no, the Corb's very important in this, and of course, you know, the Corb scholars struggle with Brussels, the Brussels Pavilion, you know, but sure. It's also quite good and related because it's taking that the string notion is all through these cables that are holding it all together.
Sure.
Right. Simpatico.
I don't see other questions popping up. One remaining for me that you could also leave to a next time is how we ever got from the 3 stories to the 60s. That was your story in the very beginning, but maybe that is a complete new lecture, I guess, no?
I will leave you with one word: charm.
Okay.
You could also have inventiveness if you want.
Yeah, or a combination. Or also Laszlo Moholy-Nagy maybe could help there, yeah, with tackling.
Oh, yeah. There you go. I hope this was the right bandwidth for your discussion. You know, the idea of reaching outside of the work to see if you can develop a group of thinkers that essentially make a roundtable for discussion. I think if you look at abstraction, if you look at geometry versus the figure, if you look at drawing as it relates to the object, look at craftsmanship, look at surface versus volume. You know, if you look at creation or cosmology versus, you know, an internal tautology in the work, amongst these 8 people, you really get a very lively discussion. And I don't want to say that they were all there for my father. I can't believe that they would all be, or the same way. I don't think it worked that way. But I think as we move forward and we look to try to figure out how to get some control over form, how to wrestle it to the ground, we have this whole arena of 3-dimensional curved form without really critical thinking. You know, oh, it looks nice, or it looks, you know, wobbly, or it looks, you know, intense. That's not very definitive. So, you know, in this plethora of shapes that are out there, you know, I think this is one way to get a handle on them. And, you know, that's, you know, so in a sense, this tumbles forward from the work, from his work to Lilian, and from Lilian to these artists. Then you start collecting through these artists which ones are relevant. And you start seeing, you know, each one of these brings something to the table of significance.
Thanks again so much for being with us, giving your time and your knowledge. Thanks for the audience to be here. Thanks, Martien, for the invitation, because it's your contact that you brought to this program. About the program, there is super good news today about physical exhibition being installed today at our campus in Brussels, which is always a celebration, but in COVID times it's even more a celebration. So go and see that. It's the exhibition within the urban culture engagements, and it is the work of Asiya Sadiq and her students for over 7 years. And actually Martien was pretty much involved there also in those studios. So very nice to see. There's also a booklet there, and there will be a panel discussion on the 12th of May about it. Then we will have upcoming lectures. Jan Boele is coming. Well, just follow all the program on the blog or subscribe to the newsletter to follow the program. And for now, have a great night, or for you the rest of the day. I hope to see you soon again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.